Our Kikuo Johnson was born and raised on the island of Maui and fell in love with comics at a young age. That love never left, and today he is an award-winning graphic novelist and illustrator. Recently, he received a Hawaiʻi Award as one of the 10 most promising emerging writers in the country.
I'm Kikuo Johnson. I'm an illustrator and comic book artist. I was born on Maui, and we grew up in Makawao, and it rains a lot up there, so I spent a lot of times inside. My dad had lots of paper, was drawing all the time, and never stopped. When I was about 8, I think I found comic books, and I was hooked. My brother had this one comic. It was like a G.I. Joe comic, I think, and it had an advertisement for another comic, and it was about this big, and it was a drawing of Wolverine. But when they photographed it, they kind of made all the color go to black and white, so it's super edgy and dramatic, and it's the cover of Wolverine #1 by Frank Miller, where he's like this, and it looked scary, it looked intimidating, but also I was so drawn to it as a little kid because there's nothing like that, like in the cartoons I've seen on TV. So I begged my dad to take me to the comic book store, and that was that. Right after I got my first comic, I was about in 3rd grade, and I started drawing my own comics almost immediately. I think like one of the things that's super appealing about comics is that it's just paper and staples, really. And if you have a pencil, then you can make your own comic. I kept all these old comics that I was making when I was a little kid. Windman versus Dark Destructor. Definitely needed a copy editor for these ones. When I was a kid, I was super attracted to the superhero stories. When you're a kid, you have power fantasies, and that's a way to kind of an outlet for that. But pretty soon, I was still buying comics, and I just actually didn't care that much about the stories. The superhero genre just wasn't that interesting to me. And as I became a teenager, I found other kind of independent comics and other stories, and just got attracted to like regular novels. The stories that always appeal to me typically are just family relationships, like how people that love each other are interacting. And those are the stories I'm drawn to. Those are just the stories I want to read, and those are the stories that I wanted to make. So I was always drawing, but it never occurred to me that it was a job, like you could actually make a living this way. My parents saw me just drawing all the time in my spare time, and I was actually shocked that my parents, by the time I was a senior, was like, "Have you thought about art school?" I couldn't believe that they would like push in that kind of less stable direction. And I'm just super grateful that I have supportive parents, and it made sense. It's all I ever wanted to do. I would just be doing it anyway. I went to the Rhode Island School of Design. Super far, but I wanted an adventure. While I was in school, I did a comic called Night Fisher. I started it my junior year. I worked on it for another 3 years. So when I was working on Night Fisher, and I was living in New York at that point with some of my classmates that I graduated with, and I was waiting tables, and I was sharing an apartment with 3 other guys, and I was broke. The thing that kept me going, that kept me like, this is worth it, this is a story that's worthwhile, was I really wanted to show the Hawaii that I knew, because in any of the media I saw, I didn't recognize the Hawaii that was presented at all, and especially not the Maui that I knew. And so I tried to write a book that really presented a version of Maui that I really, really recognized, and that really kept me going, and I believe that it was something that needed to be put out. I convinced myself that it was worth struggling for. Looking back at it, I'm 40 years old now. I wrote it when I was 21. Now looking back, I do see that I was working out a lot of the kind of events of my high school years, and some of it is autobiographical, a lot of it is fiction. It's kind of a mix of both. To be honest, I was never sure how I was gonna totally make it all work. I just knew that I really wanted to draw comics, and I thought if I made something that got out there and people saw it, I hoped that that might lead to other opportunities. I was like, I'll make this comic and this will be my debut and people hopefully will see it. And it actually worked. Amazingly, it came out, people saw it, and people started hiring me to do drawings for their magazines. It takes about a year for like a book to go from it being announced and then finally being published. And during that year, I was trying to publish comic strips in magazines. So I would just like make up emails. I'd look at the art director and it'd be like John Smith. So I'd be like John_Smith@outdoormagazine.com. And I would email John Smith and be like, hey, publish this comic strip, please. And of course, everybody either just didn't answer or rejected me. And eventually I started submitting stuff to the New Yorker. And amazingly, I got an email back from the New Yorker. And they said, we don't know what you want us to do with this comic strip. Like, that's not how it works. But we do have an article that we'd like you to illustrate because I have your book on my desk. They sent it to us as a review copy. I love it. Do you want to do this illustration for us? And so that was kind of my break where I finally started kind of pivoting to paid magazine work, and that became my bread and butter and how I kept the lights on in New York for a while. I had already worked for the New Yorker for years at this point doing interior illustrations, which were really fun to do, but like kind of the holy grail as a professional illustrator is to try to get a cover. One reason for that is that it's a really rare illustration gig where the illustrator comes up with a concept. Most of my job is illustrating someone else's idea, but for the New Yorker, it's all about coming up with your own idea, telling your own story. So after years of submitting ideas, something finally clicked and I got my first cover of the New Yorker. I got a call and Francoise was like, we need a cover. It's the music issue. We want it to take place in Brooklyn. So we want someone that lives in Brooklyn and we want someone young. We want someone new, and that's you. So we're gonna give you a try. And so I kind of had like this setup audition. It was cool because I did a bunch of different sketches. I actually went out to a club that was close to my house at the time in Brooklyn with a music writer, which was a fun night, and came up with this image. And you can see that it's like the perspective, like you're standing on a stage. And I don't know if this is a real story, but it sounded like maybe it got accepted because the editor of the New Yorker plays guitar and could imagine himself on stage playing his guitar. That was one of the rare moments in the career where, you know, you pop a bottle of champagne. For my second book after Night Fisher, I did a book called The Shark King, and the art editor for that series is a woman named Francoise Mouly, who also happens to be the art director for the New Yorker. The concept for the line is that comics are a really great way to learn to read because it's like pictures and words instead of books that parents are reading to kids. It's books that kids can read to themselves. And I got a call from the editor and she was like, have you ever thought about doing a kids comic? We're doing some like mythological stories. And immediately I thought of the Nanaue story, which is a story I grew up with, of this demigod Nanaue, half shark, half man. And it's a pretty scary story if you know the story, but it's also a story of a character with a foot in two worlds. And that really appealed to me. And I tried to honor that story as best I could while making it not quite so violent for kids. But I went to Waipio Valley and really tried to dig into what that story meant. It was such a treat just to research and really kind of dig into that mythology. There's such incredible stories. I feel like there's a lot of insight in those stories, and they survive for a reason, right? They're hundreds of years old and they survive for a reason. I've lived in Brooklyn now for years, and I still just feel like a visitor there. I don't know if that'll ever go away. I always think of Maui is home. I come home and spend about a month here every year, and it still just feels like home. I come home every winter and spend time with my family, and like when I think about family time, it's all in Hawaii, and it's the people I know, it's the people I love, and so there are stories that I've set elsewhere that don't really make sense to me. If I reset them in Hawaii, suddenly like it all becomes real and it becomes familiar. When I first started writing No One Else, I actually had set it in Massachusetts, where I was like briefly living spending a summer. And I wrote this script and it kind of didn't make sense to me, or like none of it, it didn't quite feel real, it wasn't working. And then I came home one winter, and this would have been 2015. And I was sitting up in Wailuku and looking out at a cane fire. And it just occurred to me, what if I said it right here? And what if like the cane fires were a backdrop for the island? And what if the characters were local people? And suddenly it all seemed super real. It all seemed familiar to me. It seemed natural. And then I was like, I have to write this. I started writing the book, started working on the book. And then the next year, the mill closed. So it was kind of, the story almost became like a story of mourning as this kind of era was ending. And I think there's like a magic, just as a reader, when I'm reading a story about a world that I'm not familiar with, be it a culture I'm not familiar with, I just noticed that those kind of really specific ticks of a place or of a culture or of a language make it feel so much more real. I think there's a paradox where almost the more specific you can make it a story to your own experience, the more universal it is somehow. And so if you're wanting to tell your story, I think if you can be as specific to it as possible, I think that's only a strength. So when I was a kid, I got hooked on comics and it just never went away. I just always loved them. And I think the magic of it is like reading pictures. Like in a movie, the images don't stay on the screen long enough to really study and kind of figure out what the story is from the image if you have a more complex story. One cartoonist that I really love, his name is Chester Brown, and he always says what he loves about comics is the silence and the stillness. And I couldn't agree more. It's looking at a still image and kind of deciphering all its nuance, taking your own time on it, and then going to the next image and seeing how those two images connect. It's just like a magic reading experience for me that I love, and I love a new great comic. I crave that. It's my favorite form of entertainment.